In this video, we're going to talk about microaggressions. This is an often mentioned aspect of implementing or making good on DEI in organizations, and I'm excited to learn more about it. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams, the host of HR Shop Talk. On the show, you get expert insight into anything that has to do with HR. I encourage you to subscribe to the show or podcast to continue learning from my guests. Today, my guest is Emily Williams. Emily's based out of Chicago. She's a DEI expert, and she coaches women of color to self-advocate at work. Hi, Emily. How are you?
Hi, Andrea. I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. And so you help women self-advocate at work, or women of color self-advocate at work. And I'm sure, microaggressions is going to be some part of that. And so I'm looking forward to learning more. As always, I always start at the very, very beginning of these conversations. So tell me, what is a microaggression, or what are microaggressions? And can you provide examples?
Yes, sure, absolutely. So a microaggression is often a subtle slight that can happen on a daily basis. Sometimes these slights are unintentional. Oftentimes they are not, right? So, we generally think about three types of microaggressions, micro assaults, and micro insults, and micro invalidations, okay? And so they can all look different.
Well, take us through those then. I've never heard it broken down like that. Mind you, I'll be upfront. I don't really know much about microaggressions.
And that's a challenge because a lot of people don't, even though they are very common. So a micro assault is a little bit more direct, right? That's when we hear things like overt stereotypes or jokes that are racially insensitive, culturally insensitive. It can be exclusion in the workplace. Oftentimes I coach women of color, and they'll be left off emails with information that they need to actually do their job, for example, or oftentimes in workplace cultures where exclusion is present, we can often see the presence of cliques or in groups where not everyone is invited to socialize or participate. So those would be examples of micro assaults. A micro insult, and this is where I tend to see more of the unintentional microaggressions, is the micro insults. So the things like, "Oh, you're so articulate," right? So many women of color hear that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And the underlying assumption then is that a woman of color would otherwise not be articulate, right? So the assumption is that as a woman of color, she wouldn't be articulate, right? Therefore, the person who is, doing the microaggression is saying, "Oh, you're somehow exceptional," right? Or this is oftentimes where, there's a lot of questions related to a person's culture or a person's background. For example, if, let's say, a woman of color at work, let's say her daughter gets accepted to Harvard, she shares that news in the lunchroom, and someone says, "Oh, you mean like the Harvard?" Sort of to communicate that there's no way that, a person of color could be as intelligent or smart enough to get into such an elite school. Mm-hmm. Those would be some of the things that are perhaps a little bit more unintentional, right?
Yeah. Before you move on to micro invalidations, can I ask about that? Because it's really hard to tell. Like, I can imagine myself, some white coworker at work says, "My daughter got accepted into Harvard," and I can actually see myself going, "The Harvard? Wow," to a white person. So that's not a microaggression. So how do you tell that it's a micro? How do you know that it's a microaggression?
Microaggressions rarely happen in isolation, okay? So it's often somehow embedded in the culture. So we felt these things more than once, right? And yeah, of course, someone could express surprise or congratulations to a white person who gets into Harvard, but that it would happen to a woman of color is likely communicating something else, especially if that woman of color has experienced microaggressions cumulatively, right? So microaggressions are happening in the workplace daily, right? And so we know when they're happening, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but I had interrupted your discussion of the types of microaggressions, and you were going to move on to micro-invalidation, I think.
Yeah. So like a micro-invalidation would be things like women of color not getting the same credit or praise for their work, right? Oftentimes women of color are making exceptional contributions to the workplace, to their projects, and they're, not often recognized for it, or they're not recognized in ways that are actually commensurate with their contribution. So that would be an example of a micro-invalidation. Another example of micro-invalidation would be to say something that I think is like really common, like, well, I don't see color, so I could not have meant it in that way. And so to then invalidate a woman of color's experience, right? Whereas we would often see, we can talk about this more too, people who are not women of color in the workplace often, if they say something, right, about what they're experiencing, it's taken as true automatically, right? Not that her experience is questioned, right?
Right. Okay. So what are the impacts of microaggression? First, think about the individual, because I'm sure that over time is significant. And then, but also if you would expand to the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with the individual. Microaggressions, especially the cumulative impact over time, can cause extreme harm to individuals. So we see an increase in anxiety, anxiety about going to the office, anxiety about having to be in meetings with people who are chronic microaggressors, or people who are complicit with the microaggressions, right? And so then we see that on top of, woman of color, person of color, or another person of a marginalized background, in addition to them handling their work responsibilities, they also have this other level of consideration, which is about self-protection, right? How do they protect themselves from the harm of the microaggressions? And then we also see levels of depression increase, because it can be quite a disparaging reality to know that, okay, well, I am experiencing microaggressions on a daily basis. I'm in a work environment where other people see and know these things are happening, yet they continue. One thing that I often see in my clients is that they actually will report to human resources, and there's not an effective solution that's applied to the problem, right?
We are going to talk about that.
Yes, we are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's very important.
Yeah.
But so that can contribute to a level of depression, because then, a woman of color thinks to herself, well, are things going to get better, right? And, it's not a common problem in the majority of workplaces. So then that can also contribute to depression. Also, microaggressions and the daily experience of them is actually linked to hypertension and heart disease later in life, right? So again, that goes back to the daily stress and the impacts that it does have on our bodies. Now, when we look at where the impacts for on an organizational level, I mean, absolutely, when microaggressions are common and present, there's a decrease in productivity. And not only in the person who's experiencing the microaggression, but also those who are responsible for the microaggressions, who are microaggressing others, because there too is a preoccupation with, making others feel less than in the workplace, right? And then that not only impacts the person who receives the microaggressions, but that then also impacts everyone who witnesses it. Right. So everyone then can say, okay, there's a level of safety here that I'm not totally safe. Right. Because at any point, any one of us could experience the microaggressions. But then also, even others in the organization it's weighing on them too, because they're evaluating, can I say something?
Yes.
What do I say?
And you bite your tongue.
Mm-hmm.
because you don't want to be the target.
Mm-hmm. And that's another level of stress, right? And then also that definitely impairs working relationships.
So I want to talk about microaggressions, both from the experience of someone who's experiencing them and then later from, someone who's witnessing them. But let's start with someone who's experiencing a microaggression. What can that person do?
I have an ebook that's written for women of color and people of color, and it's a guide about how to powerfully respond to microaggressions. I think the most important thing is that when you experience a microaggression is that you have to first recognize it for what it is, right? You have to understand that it will impact you, right? Even though the microaggression could have been subtle, even though it could be from someone who's junior to you in the office, and you may even know that the microaggression itself is nonsensical or is baseless, but it will still have an impact on you because it is aggression that is directed to you at work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that is the first thing, is that if you experience a microaggression, you have to recognize that it has impacted you, and you have to attend to that impact first. And then secondly, it's difficult for me to give advice without knowing the particular dynamics of a workplace. There are some situations in which I would not advise responding in the moment to a microaggression. There are some situations in which I would, but it's difficult to give that advice without knowing the specifics of a situation. I think what's most important is that women of color, people of color, those who are experiencing microaggressions, that they take care of themselves first, right? We have so much pressure to forget that the microaggression happened, focus on intentions, they probably didn't mean it, and to just keep it moving. Well, research shows us that that doesn't work, right? So then I go back to these statistics about the long-term impact of microaggressions, which is hypertension, which is heart disease. And then those things also lead to a disparity in life expectancy for people of color, right? So, it is absolutely 100% important that, as a woman of color, as a person of color, if you have experienced a microaggression, you have to take care of yourself first.
If you found this interesting or even troubling, subscribing, you'll see all the episodes about all these things that have to do with HR. But comment on this one. Are you someone who's experienced microaggressions? What did that look like for you? How did you deal with it? Let us know in the comment section. So if you're witnessing a microaggression, I imagine some of those things still apply, but maybe you have a little bit more leeway to act. What can someone who wants to take action on a microaggression do?
Yeah, well, I would say first, listen to that. If you have witnessed a microaggression and you are inclined to speak up, I would encourage that. And again, this goes back to the power dynamics in the workplace, right? So some of us have more power in the workplace than others. Yeah. So one, it's important to recognize that. Two, it's important to use that to actually advocate for your colleagues, right? And to really be an ally in that way, to say, let's say there's a woman of color who was spoken over in a meeting. It's important to say, okay, well, Maria was speaking and I want to hear what she has to say. Right. Or even to say, can we just please allow people to stop speaking before we interrupt them, right? I mean, those kinds of requests are really important for setting a standard of respect, but also for communicating that microaggressions simply won't be tolerated. Yeah.
So what are some myths around microaggressions?
Yeah, well, I would say first that the biggest myth is that words don't hurt us, right? So many of us grew up with that adage. Yes. Well, research shows that that's not true, actually, that microaggressions have, a hugely negative impact on women of color, on people of color, particularly over time. So that would be one myth, right? The other myth is that you can just drop it and move on. I rarely see that as the case. Like I said, we may be able to, sort of legitimize in our mind. We may be able to say, okay, well, I know that this person is always microaggressive, or this person is a junior and really has no consequence to me in any other respect. But even still was an act of aggression that was directed to us and that we sustained. I think the third myth is that, and this is what I often see, a mistake that organizational leaders make, that HR professionals make, is that microaggressions are somehow, it's a one-off event, that it happened in isolation, that the person didn't mean it, right? And oftentimes there actually is intent behind many microaggressions. And when we see microaggressions commonly in an organization, that then becomes part of the culture.
Well, next thing we could just move into, unless there's more myths, is that discussion of how HR what role they can play in addressing microaggressions.
Well, I think one, they also have to recognize that microaggressions often are the thing that are undermining their diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, right? It's also true that microaggressions are the things which are pushing people out of the door, right? It's often the part of the culture that is really undermining retention and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's first really important that HR professionals understand that they acknowledge that. And then it's really important that HR professionals take the proactive stance, right? Because, what we just discussed is that it can be very difficult after the fact to address a microaggression, but then the problem only continues. And oftentimes when HR doesn't address microaggressions, that's when I see cases escalate. That's when I see lawsuits being filed, right? So these are the kinds of things that are really important for HR to address. I think the other thing that I see so commonly is that particularly when women of color report microaggressions to human resources, they experience more microaggressions, right? Their complaints are dismissed, right? The tables are turned on them. I supported a client, one of my coaching clients reported to human resources, and they asked her why she hadn't reported sooner. Yet at the same time didn't provide any solutions for her, right? So these are the kind of things that really HR has to respond to effectively. And, I think the other thing is that often those who are responsible for the most microaggressions are people with power in an organization. I think also acknowledging and addressing the challenges of creating consequences for those with power in organizations when they are microaggressive is a real challenge that HR needs to address. I think too, I think it's important to talk about the benefit of the doubt, right? So oftentimes we're persuaded to give someone the benefit of the doubt. What's masked by that is our internalized white supremacy, our internalized patriarchy, right? So when we're sort of looking at these cases, when we're hearing someone come forward about experiencing microaggressions, it's almost like we're pre-wired to say, to question that person because they've come forward, right? As opposed to say, okay, well, this is there probably is some truth to what they're saying because they've taken such a risk to actually speak up about it, right? As opposed to, well, let's ask questions to really make them prove that it happens. And give this other person who's being accused the benefit of the doubt. That's also based on internalized systems of oppression.
Okay, so if there is someone out there who is in HR and wants to learn more about microaggressions and about recognizing and labeling and articulating exactly what a microaggression is, do you have any resources to suggest?
Yes, I offer a workshop called Addressing Microaggressions, One Way to Retain Women of Color. And that information can be linked in the information section for this podcast, but I would say definitely attend that workshop. The other thing is to really get the ebook for the women of color and the people of color who are on staff in your organization, and even for yourself too, so that you can begin to understand microaggressions as women of color and people of color experience it. That's a really key part of empathy. So you could benefit from reading the ebook.
Oh, I do actually have one more question to ask. You did talk about unintentional microaggressions, and I'm pretty sure everyone out there watching this is going to be like, I hope I'm not unintentionally microaggressing anyone. How can someone recognize that in themselves and manage it?
Yeah, well, I would say first, if someone is telling you that you're being microaggressive, believe them. And then really look at it, right? Like, what are the messages that you've been taught about race, about gender? Look at your own behavior. Are you really regarding everyone with the same level of respect? So I would say that if many people are asking themselves those questions anyway, without having to be told that they're being microaggressive. So if you're being told that you're microaggressive, it's more than likely that you are. So you have to believe them, and then also look at yourself, really take a hard look, and then change your behavior so that you can truly be respectful of people of all genders, all identities, and so that you can be the kind of colleague that really contributes to a safe, respectful, inclusive workplace.
Thanks, Emily. That was unfortunately necessary, and it was eye-opening for me. I did an episode on HR trends in 2022, and we covered off DEI, but not in a way you might expect. And that link is right here. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.